So what this talk isn't about, it's not about styled components, and it's also not about CSS and JS. So if you want to leave, go for it. I'll turn my back, no problems. Ready? Okay, sweet, you're all still here. That makes me feel good. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me this morning. Believe in the CSS power of. Actually, it's supposed to be believe in the power of CSS, but the way things work, that's how it ended up. But CSS is the main thing we're talking about here. So, that's the shit that matters. You can catch me on Twitter at Salt and Burnham. Where are my Supernatural fans? It's okay. You can raise your hand. This is a safe space. If you can't raise your hand, that's okay. I'm a huge accessibility advocate. I've been speaking about accessibility all week. If you can't raise your hand at all during this talk when I'm asking questions, give me a nod, give me a wink. It's all good. But I'm still going to ask, where are my Supernatural fans? Come on, you guys are a bunch of nerds and you don't watch Supernatural? What about Buffy? I'm a huge Buffy fan. My boy Ken up front, he likes Buffy. What about Charmed? Man, you guys are killing me. It's okay, this is a safe space. Nothing to be ashamed of. That's my site right there. Little blurbs about me, a link to my speaking engagements, as well as a link to my Medium blog. I blog about the web a lot. I like to write about the web a lot. So you can check all that stuff out there if you wish. So little disclaimer before we kick it into high gear. I love CSS. I truly love it. Why do I love CSS? I get questioned a lot. Why do you love it so much? I started building on the web roughly 22 years ago. Okay? Back then, we just had markup. That was it. CSS really wasn't a thing yet. JavaScript really wasn't a thing yet. You could sort of call me like an OG in the industry, I guess. But yeah, there's tons of wonderful things out there now that you can do with CSS. And if you know a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about, that's great. I'm glad you're here anyways. We can share that knowledge with each other. So thank you. Specifically for me, I'm a UI developer. I barely write any JavaScript in my role whatsoever. It's markup, it's styles, accessibility, performance, design systems, and user psychology, user experience. That's what I do. Developers like me are looked at as second class. And it's bullshit. We're devalued completely. But I'm here to tell you, any code you write, doesn't matter what it is, you're a developer regardless. So you keep doing you, and we'll be one big happy family of web workers. How's that sound? Good? All right, sweet. Has anybody seen this before? It's like evolution of CSS. When did this happen? Like, when did we just go from CSS to styled components being like the end-all, be-all to write CSS? That's not a thing, right? There's a reason we're writing CSS. Two reasons. Taking advantage of the cascade and taking advantage of inheritance. When really you think about it, it's just CSS all the way down. This is a great quote. This was from CSSConf AU earlier this year. This came from Mandy Michael. She was in a talk by Ivana McConnell about CSS. And the one key takeaway here is CSS is a key development skill. Remember how I said we're devalued in the industry as second-class devs because we don't write JavaScript every day? Or we don't know how to build the latest and greatest in whatever framework or library? It's hard for people like me, and it's hard for friends of mine to get new jobs in the industry. It's hard for us to grow and move on in the industry, to make the web beautiful, to advocate for the user. This is a big problem. And I need the support of everybody in this room and the developer community, as well as all of my other friends in the industry, to say, hey, you know what? We need developers who can write great semantic markup. who can write modular and flexible CSS. We need the support of everybody in the community for this. Here's another one that I also really like. This was also from CSS Conf AU, a really thoughtful closing talk by Ivana McConnell. She talks about the perceptions we have about CSS, developers, and the web, but also the problems with how we devalue things like CSS or people whose web journey is not the traditional archetype. The important thing to take from here, also the problems with how we devalue things like CSS. We shouldn't be devaluing things like CSS. I know I keep repeating that, but I need you to take that to heart. It's stuff like this that gets me. CSS is important. That's why we're all here today. That's why I'm here. It's still a thing. CSS is still a thing. Who likes writing CSS? Who doesn't? Okay. Well, I hope by the end of this talk, everybody walks away with something. That's why I'm here. And if you know a lot of it, like I said, that's still cool. My name is Chris. I'm a UI developer. I work for a company called United Shore in Pontiac, Michigan. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. Is anybody familiar with Quicken Loans? Everybody, probably, right? So my company, United Shore, we work on the wholesale side of mortgage. We're the #1 wholesale mortgage lending company in the United States, 3 years in a row. We work directly with brokers to find you the best deals for your broker so you can get into your dream house. So if you were to purchase or thinking about it, you could try and find a broker that works with us, and we'll try and help you as best as possible. I also think we're hiring, so if you want to move to Michigan, we have shitty winters. Come and talk to me. At least we know how to drive in the winter. How many are local to this area? Raise your hand, please. Out of state. Out of the country. Okay, cool. So I used to have like 5-6 slides that talked about me a little bit, intro slides. One was about horror, because I love horror so much. Tattoos, being from Detroit, community stuff, all of these types of things. And I got some pretty shitty feedback from a conference once. To paraphrase, it kind of went like this. We don't give a shit about you. We care about your talk. So remove that. And that hit me in the feels really hard. Really hard. The reason I put those slides in there is to show you that I'm human. I'm like everybody else in this room. I'm not a robot up here giving a talk. I like to level set. I'm a person too, and I want everybody to know that. I'm here doing what I love, everybody's here doing what they love. But there are 2 slides I'm going to keep in, and I'm never going to take them out. And if you don't like it, tough shit. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies. That's super huge for me. It was a big accomplishment. So that one's staying in there. Also, I host a podcast called Tales from the Script. It's a front-end focused podcast. It's mixed with a little bit of horror. We talk a little bit about horror. We talk about front-end stuff. It's a guest-focused podcast. So you pick the title, you pick the topic. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you're passionate about, what you're working with, how you feel about the industry. Has anybody been on a podcast before? Anybody want to be on a podcast? Cool. This was better than yesterday when I was speaking at a conference. Nobody raised their hand. I'm like, come on, you guys want to be on a podcast? I thought it was sweet when I got invited to my first podcast. You don't have to sign up. I don't have to think you're like status in the industry to be on my podcast. I don't work that way. You want to be on? You hit me up. I'll send you an invite, and we'll go from there. We can rock and roll. Tails FT Script on Twitter. You can listen to the web player at tftscript.com. It's also on the podcast app. It's also on Google Play, and it's also on Stitcher. So if you do want to be on, please reach out. I would love to have you. Anybody know who Una Kravitz is? No? Oh, definitely follow her. She's an amazing developer. She's an amazing speaker. Unbeknownst to me, she also has a talk called The Power of CSS. Front Trends 2017 is when she gave it. This is the YouTube link right here. It's an amazing talk. I didn't know she had this talk out there when I was putting mine together, when I started submitting it to conferences. I didn't bite any of her stuff. I didn't bite any of her style. I do think we talk about a few of the similar things. But please, check hers out too. And if you're not following her right now, I suggest you do. So let's talk about history. Who likes history? I like history. Awesome. I like that. I feel very strong on knowing history. Knowing where your roots are, knowing where your roots came from, knowing who paved the way for you to be successful in this industry. That's important. You should understand the why behind what you're doing, the who behind what you're doing. I get questioned a lot too on why do you care so much about the history of the web, Chris? It's necessary. Like any other industry. You say you work at the big three and you're using the Kaizen continuous improvement model. You should know the history behind that. Who started that? Let's say you're a surgeon in some type of specific field. You're going to learn about that history. You're going to learn who started that practice of medicine. Because it's important to know where and who that came from. So we are going to talk a little bit about history, but it's not going to be too long. Who remembers writing markup like this? So I started writing code in 1996. And this is how we did it. This is something out of like HTML 4.01 for Dummies. Right, that was like my first book. I started with QBasic. I switched over to HTML. Like this is how I did my shit when I was a kid. And nothing was indented. Oops. Nothing was indented. Everything was in capital letters, all of the tags. When you wanted to center something, you would center it with a center element. Let's see what else we got here. I'm gonna sit right here if you don't mind. We got a font color of red. Family Comic Sans, because you know Comic Sans was all the rage back in the day. That's how you did the font size. You did a plus and then a number to delineate the size of that. Heading horizontal rules, you could put a width and a color on those. I thought that was awesome. Marquee tag. Marquee tag still works, believe it or not. It's deprecated, but it still works. Then we have a couple break tags in there, some more Comic Sans, font color lime, because lime on black, sign me up. Sign me up. Yeah, this is how we did it back in the day. I was writing in Notepad on a Windows 95 machine. Yeah, I said that. Windows 95. Notepad. Notepad today, if you were to use Notepad, it's like, what the hell are you doing? Where are my VS Code fans at? Yes, all right. Best friends till the end. No indentation. How did we ever get here? How did I do this? How was I able to do this? I did it though, and you can actually check this out on my CodePen. All of this markup still works. Who remembers the blink tag? Under construction, right? Did you know that there's actually an implementation to bring blink back into the browser? But not a tag, not an actual blink element. I think it's a CSS thing or a JavaScript thing. But that's cool, because that brings dumb shit back to the browser. Anybody follow Sarah Vieira? Sarah's awesome. She just creates dumb shit. She wants to feel freedom again. So that's cool. If you don't follow her, I suggest you do. So let's go way back. Way back to 1994. Or Chris was writing code. Actually, not yet. A couple years later. For 2 years, Hakim Lee and Bert Boss worked together to create a style language. They created a style language for this thing called hypertext markup language. Has anybody heard of it? If you haven't, It's pretty sweet. The short version is HTML. Then it was like XHTML for like extensible hypertext markup language. Now we're at HTML5. HTML is pretty sweet. If you don't know what it is, buy a book. You'll learn a bunch of shit, trust me. So Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who kind of started all of this at CERN in the late 90s, wanted a markup language that was different from browsers. Later implementation. These two right here made that possible. These two right here are the reason we have CSS today. Who knows this guy? Big Dog Wes, Mr. Green Egg Wes, my Canadian friend from across the pond. These two aren't related, if you were wondering. They do have blonde hair, they do have blue eyes. One's Canadian, one's not. I think Wes even has something on his website about, like, he's at like an FAQ. And it specifically says, Bert Boss is not my dad. Stop asking. December of 1996, CSS 1 becomes an official recommendation. The state of the web as we knew it would forever change. The way we would design experiences would change in ways unimaginable. It's an amazing time to be a developer right now in the industry. So, what's new? We have a lot of new things out there. Some stuff is fully supported in the browser, some stuff isn't. Like I said earlier, some stuff you might already know about. You might be using in production. That's great. I'm super stoked for that. Some browsers. IE11? Not so much. Who supports IE11? A lot of people, I'm sure. What about IE9? What about lower than that? No shit. Fuck. Brother, I'm sorry. But that's cool, that's okay. IE11's dying in 2025. We got some time left. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about Flexbox. We're going to talk a little bit about grid. CSS variables. What? CSS variables? Where are my JavaScript developers at? Ken, raise your hand. Yeah, we got variables in CSS now. You should be shaking in your Yeezys, homie. CSS variables, that's amazing, right? We got blend modes, viewport units. One thing I love to talk about, accessibility, which I'm going to cover. And we have more. So let's talk a little bit about architecture. I love architecture. I love front-end architecture. If you don't think there's a front-end architecture, ask Micah Godbolt. He wrote a great book called Front-End Architecture for Design Systems. Brad Frost also wrote a book called Atomic. Great, great books if you want to learn more about design systems and front-end architecture. So we have BEM. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier, and it's written like this. There's two different ways you can write it. You can write it the double-double, where you have the double underscore, double dash. The block is like the outside container. The element are the things inside of that. So that could be like a heading, a subheading, image, body copy, links. Then we have a modifier. So you can change how those elements look or how that block looks. You can also write it like this, single, single. Quick note about doing it this way though, if you have like customer-form, that's your block. So if you're experiencing stuff like that where you're separating an actual block or an element or a modifier with a dash, to not get that confused if you're running single, single, camel case it. Camel case the block, the element of the modifier. That way you can, keep things more specific a little bit. You're not getting confused with how that's working. We have SMACs. SMAC stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for Cascading Style Sheets. This was created by Jonathan Snook. Anybody follow Jonathan Snook? Everybody in here should. The way that works is you break out your styles into separate files. You have like your base styles, which kind of define, heading level elements and stuff like that. And you have your layout modules, state, themes, kind of keep everything separated. I've actually had to build code examples for interviews, and they wanted me to mix BEM and SMAX together. Let me tell you, that's fun. Two separate architectures, mixing them together. It's not that uncommon. You can see that in the wild a lot. We have Inuit CSS. This was created by Harry Roberts. CSS Wizardry on Twitter. Anybody follow Harry? There's another one. I would definitely follow him. Amazing developer, amazing consultant, speaks all around the world on CSS. That's just an architecture framework. There's nothing much really behind that. We have Atomic by Brad Frost. Anybody follow Brad Frost? Okay, cool. The way this works is that it's kind of based off of atoms, right? So you have your atoms, and you comprise all your atoms together to make up molecules. Then those make up an organism, and that makes out a layout and a page, yada yada. And then we have OOCSS, Object-Oriented Cascading Style Sheets. This was created by Nicole Sullivan. Stubbornella on Twitter. Anybody follow Nicole Sullivan? Do that too. The way that works, there's two main concepts behind OOCSS. Separation of content and container, and separation of structure and skin. You want to know more about that? We can talk about that later. Architectures make writing CSS fun, right? We're using Vue and React and Angular and all these other libraries and frameworks because it makes it easy and fun to write JavaScript. But it also makes your CSS maintainable, makes it modular, and it also makes it flexible. Now, I give a talk, I haven't given it in a long time, but it's called CSS Modularity for the Masses. Block Element Magic, CSS Modularity for the Masses. If you want to check out the slides are right here. I can also tweet out a link to this deck specifically, so you can have a link to this if you just want to check out those slide decks and learn a little bit more about CSS architectures. Flexbox, who's using Flexbox in production? Okay, cool. I'm going to be showing a lot of can I use screenshots. Can I use is your go-to to figure out whether or not browsers support anything. Markup, JavaScript, CSS, latest and greatest features. See where your browsers are at as far as versioning. There's links to like global stats to see around the world and across the Americas who's coming from where, what browsers are being used. So Flexbox has pretty good support across the board. That's really good. Flexbox is great because it's one-dimensional. Now, what do I mean by one-dimensional? This is how it works. It works on a main axis and a cross axis. So it works on two axes. But it only works on one at a time. So you can either flex stuff going top to bottom, or you can flex stuff going left to right. The axis, or the axes, are determined by the flex direction on the parent container, called the flex direction. So depending on what the parent container is saying, those child items will be flexing in a row or flexing in a column. You can also do reverse as well, reverse row, reverse column, and that flips the axis, and it gets kind of confusing. When the flex direction changes, so do the axes. What's the number one problem we have with CSS? And I don't want a cascade, no. Inheritance, no. What's the number one problem? If you know what it is, shout it out. Come on, everybody's had this problem before.
Centering horizontally and vertically.
Thank you. That's what I'm talking about. Horizontal and vertical centering. Centering is a pain in the ass. But not anymore, it's not. Spacing stuff with margin 0 auto. Doing like negative percentages on things with translates and all these other things we don't need to do, and positive numbers. We don't have to do that anymore. Not with Flexbox. If I told you it only takes 3 properties to center something horizontally and vertically within a parent, would you believe me? Yeah, no, maybe, so, huh? Well, we can do that. And this code pen is also out there too if anybody wants to check it out. I have the slides at the link to it at the end of my slides. The parent element has a class of main title, and I'm sorry if this is really small. When I was building this, I never zoomed it out. You put a display of flex on it. I did a flex direction of column just for sanity check. I did a justify content center, which brings it down, and then I do an align item center, and that shoots it right over to the middle. Done. 3 lines of code, and we just centered a child element inside a parent. It's pretty cool, right? 3 lines of code, no big deal. We have grid. Who's using grid in production? He was like, oh, no, I'm not. I saw that, he's not even paying attention. It's all good. Good support with grid across the board, except for Opera Mini. Nothing is supported in Opera Mini, so it doesn't really surprise me too much. Grid is 2-dimensional. What do I mean by that? What does 2 dimensions mean? Grid works on both axes, X and Y. It works in rows and columns. Since it works this way, we've been able to create layouts that we could have never dreamed were possible before. You can't create these layouts with Bootstrap. How many are using Bootstrap in production? Unfortunately, I am. Foundation, shoelace, toast, skeleton, 960 grid system. Ooh, going way back. Magazine and flyer style layouts are things we can create now on the web. It's awesome. It's truly awesome. This is Miriam Suzanne's website. If you don't follow her, I suggest you do. She's an amazing developer and also an amazing speaker. She co-wrote a book on Sass with Hugo Girardel. This was built in Grid. She's also an advocate for design systems in CSS as well, and Sass. Anybody familiar with Suzy? Miriam created Suzy. Responsive framework using Sass. That whole thing was created using Grid. Here's another one. This is Andy Clark's website. Whole thing was built in Grid. And believe it or not a single line of JavaScript for this whole entire website. Would you believe me if I told you that? CSS variables, Grid, Flexbox, viewport units, feature queries, CSS shapes. That's how you get this right here. You just define a polygon around here and it, boom. That can get a little tricky. A lot of math. Trust me. There's a generator out there. There might be a few, but there is one out there that will create CSS shapes for you. So you can just copy and paste the code. Because if anybody failed geometry in high school, I almost did. Yeah, I can't do the math like that. This is another amazing example right here. This is the Mondrian grid created by Piet Mondrian. He was a famous artist who expressed his vocabulary in the 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, the 3 primary values, black, white, and gray, and the primary directions, horizontally and vertically. Jen Simmons, what she did was she took the Mondrian grid, cut it up, put it back together using grid, and then made it responsive. This is huge. This is a big win. If you don't follow Jen Simmons, I suggest you do. I'm going to say that a lot throughout this talk. Also, if you don't follow Ken Wheeler, I suggest you do. Just kidding. No, Ken's a great guy. Here's another example of a magazine flyer style layout that Jen also did as an experiment. In this one specifically, you'll see these grid tracks and these lines. I'm using Firefox for this. This is the dev edition. I think this was released before Quantum. There's amazing dev tools right now that have grid implementations in Firefox. Chrome doesn't have it yet. Hopefully they're coming soon. I really hope to see it. But Firefox does. So you can inspect these experiences and tell whether or not they were built using grid. And you can see the different pieces that make up that experience. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit later. So in this example, I'm creating the Holy Grail layout. The Holy Grail layout used to be a pain in the ass. Header, a sidebar, a main, a sidebar, and a footer. Stuff is supposed to be static while the other is fluid. It used to be really, really hard to do with vanilla CSS. Not so much anymore. So what I'm doing is that the grid, the class of grid I put to display grid, then I'm setting the grid template columns to 150 pixels, auto 150. That way we'll have an 150 pixel sidebar, auto in the middle, so it'll take up the remaining space, and then 150 on the other side. I set the grid template rows to auto, 1FR auto. 1FR is a new unit in CSS called a fractional or a fraction. It'll take up a fraction of that space that's left over. So the top and the bottom are set to auto. The middle is set to 1FR. I set a grid gap to 1M. You can set a grid gap to any size you want. Think of these as your gutters and bootstrap. You can set them to whatever size you want. I set the height to 100 VH, so it takes up 100 viewport unit height, which is 100% of the viewport regardless of screen. I set the header to grid row 1 so that it takes up the whole row at the top. In the grid column 1-4, so it starts here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it takes up that whole entire space. Sidebar A is a grid row 2, and the grid column 1, 2. So it starts at the first line and ends at the second of the column. And it's in this row right here. The main is a grid row 2, so this is the second row. The main starts at the second line of the row, or the column, and ends at the third. The sidebar, grid row of 2, grid column 3, 4, so it starts at the 3 and ends at the 4. And then the footer. It's on the third row down here, so there's a grid row of 3. And then it has a grid column of 1, 4. So you say start at 1 and end at 4, and it spans the whole thing. There's easier ways, there's less painful ways of doing it like this, but to break it down at its most granular level so you can understand what's happening, this is how you would write that code. Everybody cool with me so far? Sweet. Two very important people in the industry right now. Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrew. They are doing amazing things with grid, in implementation, in spec. If you don't follow Jen or Rachel, I really suggest you do. Again, they speak around the world on grid and other topics on CSS. They've written books. They've been on podcasts. Jen has her own podcast. She also has a series on YouTube called Layout Land, where she talks all about Flexbox. She talks about CSS. Well, of course, Flexbox and grid, CSS shapes, variables, stuff like that. Everything that's out there now and things that we want to get into the browser today. The only way we can get things in the browser is if we as a developer community come together and reach out to our vendors. Hey, we want this cool feature. Oh, I have 10 more people that want this cool feature. Put it in, see what happens. Where are my Firefox users? Chrome? Safari? Edge? IE11? It's all good. When I thought I couldn't use Firefox, they came out with Quantum. Newest version of Firefox. It's really fast. That's why they gave it the name Quantum. Like I was showing earlier, it's the only browser that I know of currently at the moment that is implementation of the dev tools for grid checking. Checking is whether or not that experience is using grid or not. So in this example, you can see I'm using Firefox and I'm checking. There's like a little grid right here. Come on. I did this with LiceCap, and LiceCap is super slow. And I don't use LiceCap anymore. But you can change the color of the grid lines itself. Excuse me. You can display the area names. You can see where the grid line numbers are. It's really hard to see the green, and I do apologize, but you can see the different numbers. You can see down here in the corner, you can click on each one. It'll highlight the different parts of the grid to see what is what, where one starts, one ends. So if you're building grid in production right now, Firefox is an amazing browser to be using for that specifically. Viewport units, I love viewport units. Who likes viewport units? Who knows what viewport units are? All right, we're going to learn a little bit about viewport units. Good implementation across the browsers except for Opera Mini. We don't like Opera Mini. This is how this runs right here. Kind of works this way. You set a height. If you want something to be 100% of the viewport height, the width is the same way. If you want to take up 100% of the width, you do 100 VH, 100 VW, or 50. However much percentage of that piece you want to see on the screen is what you set right there. So in this example, I set the main title to have a VH of 100. So it takes up 100%. And right there, that's it. So if you like those single type experiences like that are above the fold, where you have all the information right there, you set that main class to 100 VH and you're done. Let's say you have a hero image, because we see these all around the world, or all around in the wild in the industry. Hero images usually take up 50 to 25 to 50% of the screen. It's not doing that right now because I accidentally set it to 100, but I do set it to 50. So stuff like this is good for above the fold content. I know above the fold, people don't like hearing that, but I like above the fold content. Above the fold content matters. So you can set it to 50 VH, and then you can use that for your hero element. CSS variables are custom props. This is huge. This is really, really big. Decent support across the board. Opera Mini, no. IE11, no way. It's never going to happen. Who uses SAS in production? What about less? Stylus. What was that? Yes? Yeah, I do. Oh, I don't want to show that off. Cool. So SAS and less variables are great, but they're not the same thing. The introduction of having variables in the browser in CSS is huge. We do have some drawbacks, though, when it comes to variables and then pre-processing variables. The drawbacks of your less and your SAS and your stylus variables, they're DOM unaware. The browser, the DOM, the document object model doesn't know what they are. They're not interpreted at the browser. They're processed before your code gets shipped down. So the DOM has no clue what those variables are. You can't change them dynamically. If you can't change them dynamically, that means they're not reactive. Therefore, there's no JavaScript targets. You can't target those variables. As hard as you try, it's not going to happen. But we have pros of the CSS variables. We can take full advantage of inheritance with CSS variables. We can take advantage of the cascade. And you could also target them with JavaScript, which is pretty cool. So a couple use cases for custom props. You can emulate non-existent rules. This is really cool. I actually saw the demo of this right here. What this code is doing, it's setting the shadow of the box to yellow by default, but then changing it to orange on hover. You weren't able to do that before. Now you can with CSS variables. We have themes. So usually you would kind of write out a theme like this. Your button is your skin, your block for your block element modifying architecture. And you would set stuff in there just like that. But now you can do it like this. You can scope all of your variables to your class or ID. That's huge. Scoping the variables is a big deal. So you just do it all up here, and you just use it right here, and this will not bleed out because it's scoped to that class. You can also check for support using feature queries. Just like this, @supports. If it's supported, okay, great, use it. If it's not supported, have a fallback. Make sure you do provide a fallback support for graceful degradation and progressive enhancement. Here's another one. You can conditionally load in that CSS or not, depending if the browser supports it. Usually if you're targeting browsers that don't, you're going to want to create a separate style sheet, or you can build on top of what you have to make sure it does work for the browsers that don't support grid, or CSS variables, sorry. So the way the syntax works is that you can declare it at the root, and you have a double dash, whatever the developer semantic class is. I talk a lot about developer semantics. A lot of times we're writing CSS, we don't know how to name shit. Naming shit is hard. We all know that. But the more specific you can be about what that is doing, the easier it is for you 6 months down the line to know what's going on, or the developer that's coming behind you. So this is how you write it, and this is how you would use it. Use a var keyword, and then in parentheses, double dash the name of the variable, and you're good to go. So in this example right here, I set everything at the root level, so everything that's below it that isn't scoped to the class or ID will take on those variables. So the background color right here to the header color, the sidebar, the main, and then the sidebar B to those colors. Everybody cool with this so far? CSS variables are pretty sweet, right? We can use these now. This is great. I do talk a little bit about variable scoping as well, but I might not run through that. If you want to come check it out, we can run through that later. We have blend modes. This is kind of a big deal. This is sort of a bummer, this one right here. Edge and IE11, Edge hopefully catches up. IE11, no. Blend modes, image effects in the browser. But being able to filter images and doing effects like these in the browser, what do you think that means for image manipulation? If you know what it is, shout it out.
So your Photoshop filter.
No more Photoshop. No more Photoshop. Maybe for older experiences, yes. Newer browsers, no. Multiply, screen, color burn, color dodge. We know all of these terms because they all do different imaging and filter effects to different images. So we have two types of blend modes. We have background blend mode and we have mixed blend mode. The example I'm going to run through on my code pen is going to show background blend modes. There's 15 of them total, 16 if you count the normal look of the actual image. I'm just going to run through 6 of those 15. Three different kind of styles on those. You have initial, which is going to take the default setting of the property that does not set the blend mode. You have inherit, which inherits the blend mode from its parent. And then you have unset, which removes that blend mode from an element. So right here, I just have a set of images. The first one's going to be multiply screen, overlay, darken, lighten, color dodge. I just have the background image with a color, and then you do the background blend mode multiply, and then it'll multiply for you. What multiply is, it's the background image and the background color are multiplied, and typically this leads to a darker image than before. Screen, both the image and the color are inverted, multiplied, and then inverted again. So you can see there's a lot of work behind this implementation. Overlay, the background color is mixed with the background image to reflect the lightness or the darkness of the backdrop. We have darken. If the background image is darker than the background color, then the image is replaced. Otherwise, it's left as it was. We have lighten. If the background image is lighter than the background color, then the image is replaced. Otherwise, that is also left as it was. Color dodge, the background color is divided by the inverse of the background image. And it's very similar to the screen blend mode. Pretty cool stuff, right? Blend modes in the browser. Ooh, one of my favorite topics right here. This is one I speak about internationally, everywhere. Show of hands, how many front-end devs are in here? Back-end devs. QAs. BAs. Product owners or stakeholders. Who works on accessibility? Oh, you all should have had your hands raised. I am disappointed in everybody in this room. You've all failed that test. But that's okay, we're friends. I still love everybody in this room. Does anybody know what the combination of letters and numbers is called? Not the name of this, but what it's called, the technical term.
Weight.
What's that?
By the weight.
No. You're going high level. No, the technical term for this combination of letters and numbers. Does anybody know what that word is called?
Alphanumeric.
What's that?
Alphanumeric.
See, we have a smartass in the audience. All right. Sort of. It's called a numeronym. What a numeronym is you take the first letter, the last letter, and you count the numbers in between, you smash them together, and you get A11Y. So if you've heard the term A11Y, ally or ally, in the context of web and software, that means accessibility. You've seen this in the wild elsewhere as well. I18N, that's a numeronym, internationalization. I10N, localization, that's a numeronym. That's what that's called specifically. But the term A11Y stands for accessibility. We have focus. That's an accessible style. It's a pseudo class. It's written like this, :focus. What focus does, it gives the visual cue that a user is focused in interacting with something on the page. That's what focus does. Don't do that. Please don't set the outline to 0 or the outline to none. If you do that, make sure you have something that styles that put that focus back in place, regardless if it has to match your branding or whatever the case may be. This is unacceptable. When you remove focus, you remove it for everybody. You remove it for your mouse users, you remove it for your keyboard users, you remove it for your sip and puff users, you remove it for your Braille machine users. Don't do it. How many are familiar with CSS resets? So we have two of them. We have Eric Meyer's reset, which is the most popular. We have normalize. Normalize sucks, don't use it. Eric Meyer's reset, he specifically removes the outline, but he explicitly says to add that back in later. However you want to do it. If you have to match your branding, go for it. Small little demo on focus. This is how this works. focus to the window, tab through, and you get an outline around those elements. Those are native elements. A native input, 2 native buttons. The bottom one has styles on it. That's coming from the keyboard though. Mouse would be different. If I was using the mouse right now, I would just get the focus ring around the input, an indication that both those buttons were clicked, and that's it. That's how focus works. We have focus visible. This is really cool. It's in the CSS4 working draft. There is a polyfill out there right now. What this does, it's based on heuristics. So depending if your user is coming from the mouse or the keyboard, it will remove focus from certain elements. For the mouse users, it'll add them back in for your keyboard users. It's really, really cool. A handful of great developers and engineers at Google created the polyfill. This is the polyfill for it. github.com/wcig/focus-visible. 2 of those developers, Rob Dodson and Alice Boxhall, 2 other people you should follow. This is how that code works. So just like it'll put a class on something, if it does not have a focus visible, it'll put the outline as 0. I'm not going to demo it. If you want to check it out, catch me outside. I said that joke the other day at one conference and I got laughs, and the other one was like, wah, wah. But that's okay. We have focus within. This is really cool. Una actually posted about this on Twitter a couple months ago. She saw it on the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, and I'm like, wow, this is sweet. I didn't even know this was a thing. The way this works is that you have like a parent element, and you put a colon focus within, and you can change all the properties inside of it. This is kind of how that works. I have a background of orange, and then the color of the font to black. When I focus to something inside that parent container, everything gets focus. So you know, hey, this is where I'm at in the experience. I know I'm here. I change it to red. You can change anything you want. Same thing with focus. If you want to match your branding, you can change the border around elements for focus. You can change the font size, the color, the font family. Because we know marketing and designers, they love their branding. But this is really cool. So if you're not using focus within now, maybe check in and see if you could use it. I don't know about you, but this is how I feel about CSS, and I hope everybody in this room does too. Does everybody feel this way about CSS right now? Woo! Right? Woo! That's what I like to see. Good. Cool, cool. I had a lot of resources, so I had to put them all in a gist. I'll give everybody 5 seconds to take a picture of that if they want. 5, I don't see phones out. 4, 3, 2, 2.5, phones up, almost 1. Not 1, 1, okay. That's me. Salt and Burnham on Twitter. Oops. There's my code pen. There's my slides. And that's my time. Thank you all.